Welcome to the EDC committee tonight, July 8th, 2015, and we'll get started with an adoption of the agenda. Skip?
You need a motion, Mr. Chair.
Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Motion.
Meet as, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, the agenda has been, the adoption of the agenda has been approved.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, you need to take a vote.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you for that correction. The approval of the minutes from May 13th, 2015. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second? Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And the minutes from May 13th have been approved. Open business forum? We have no open business forum items, so we will go to the election of the officers. Currently, I am the chair of this committee, and Craig is the vice chair. Do I have a nomination on the floor for either a, should we start with the vice chair? Do I have a motion on the floor for a vice chair of this committee?
I'll nominate Amit Shah for vice chair.
I will second that. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And Amit is our new vice chair. So now we will elect a new chair, or we will re-elect the current chair. Do we have any motions from the committee?
I say re-elect you.
Second.
In favor?
Work with you, so.
What's that?
I always want to work with you.
Well, you are the vice, though.
What? For you, sorry.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, so I will retain my chairmanship for the next couple of years. So we have elected a new vice chair, and we have re-elected the chair of the EDC committee. And now we have a guest presenter, Tom, the IT director, to speak on the overview of the Dakota County Broadband Initiative. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Commissioners, and thank you for having me tonight. My name is Tom Venables. I'm the IT Director with the City of Burnsville. I've been with the city for 22 years. Been involved in broadband initiatives over the course of most of those years in representing the city and our efforts and partnerships with other communities within Dakota County and Dakota County itself. I'm here tonight to talk about an initiative that's currently underway countywide that the city is participating in, along with several other partners throughout the county. I'm also using materials that were provided by the Dakota County CDA, or Community Development Authority. They are taking a lead in this effort and organizing and coordinating an effort to discuss and bring forward options for looking at enhancing and delivering better broadband services throughout Dakota County. And I'll speak to that tonight through the presentation. The slides and the materials I'm using tonight are a Burnsville version of slides provided by the CDA, specifically Craig Ebling, consultant that's working for the CDA on this effort, along with the groups involved. In the background that was provided tonight, I gave a little background in regards to the city's history as it relates to broadband. And when I speak about broadband, I can define that for you in a broad sense. What it means essentially is we're talking about the infrastructure that delivers high-speed services, internet-based services, video services, data services to destinations or facilities throughout a community. That can be technology like copper cable. That can be fiber optics. That can be wireless also. Those are all in many ways defined as broadband. But specifically, the initiative and the effort that's going forward right now is focused on fiber optic broadband. And the reason for that is fiber optics provide high-speed, what we call ultimate high-speed services that other types of technologies cannot necessarily provide at the same level. So tonight's discussion will focus on that. One of the slides I also provided in your background materials gives you an idea of Burnsville's involvement in broadband. It goes as far back as 1995, so we're into this for about 20 years now. We started out in 1995 with some initiatives called Partnerships for Tomorrow, where we partnered with the local school district to implement a broadband network to connect city and school facilities using cable modem technology back in 1995. That was our first venture into it, all the way to several different initiatives over those number of years, and a couple that I'll just point out that are significant that relate to the discussion tonight. In 2005, we entered into a joint powers agreement with several other cities, Dakota County, the state of Minnesota, and Independent School District 196, to jointly implement and install some fiber optic cable to connect cities and school facilities that mutually benefited those entities. Primarily, it was an initiative led by ISD 196, and in other facilities and schools, cities were invited to participate in that initiative to connect our facilities and share the cost of that. And today we still have that joint powers agreement in place. We're still benefiting from that joint powers agreement. We share the cost, the ongoing maintenance, the ongoing use of that facility. And that's a similar type of initiative that we're trying to take forward at a larger level county-wide now, involving all cities and multiple agencies within the county. Up until the timeline also shows that Burnsville City Council has been very engaged in broadband discussion and broadband efforts over the same period of time. They've provided direction to staff to continually look for ways to enhance broadband technology in the community while not becoming a service provider per se, but making sure that service providers today in town either partner with us to provide better service to residents and commercial agencies, also partner with others to continually enhance broadband so that, in a sense, you can get the services you need at a fast, high speed, and hopefully competitive rate for your home and business use. We've also partnered in the past, too, with other service providers on wireless initiatives, and that's part of the timeline here, too. Up until 2011, one of the initiatives that started in 2011 was part of a what we call HIP initiative. HIP stands for High Performance Partnerships. They're countywide groups, subcommittees that were formed to look at ways we could collaborate in several areas of local government. And that ranged from how can we collaborate on IT services, how can we collaborate on HR services, how do we collaborate on public safety services. And one of the biggest outcomes of those initiatives was the Dakota County, or the Dakota Communication Center, the consolidated dispatch center that is in existence today. In the county, back before 2007, we had 5 dispatch centers countywide. Today we only have one, and that was one of the HIP initiatives. Another subcommittee that came out of those HIP initiatives was what we call a dark fiber task force, kind of a fancy name for a group, but really what it was is it was a recognition of there's a lot of fiber optic assets in the county at that time that public entities like the city of Burnsville and other cities in Dakota County owned for their own uses. How could we collaborate and leverage that technology to continue to enhance broadband services throughout the county? And as part of that, the HIP initiative group delivered a report in 2012 that highlighted the need to have a formal study brought forward to identify all the possible ways to take advantage of that fiber optic infrastructure that exists. And out of that, what are some options or outcomes that we could look at and take advantage of? And that's really the crux of my discussion tonight and the overview that I'm going to continue on with. As I indicated earlier, we've had a long history of broadband discussion, not only in the city, but countywide. We talked about the HIP initiative. One of the outcomes of that HIP report in 2012 was make certain that the economic development issues were addressed in the study that was delivered to the group. The technical study was completed in 2014 by a consulting firm called Design 9 out of Virginia. Design 9 has a long-standing background in helping communities build better broadband networks, identify opportunities to take advantage of and build out services so that public and private partnerships can take place. One of the outcomes of the study was this idea of recommending and creating a joint powers agreement that could work on behalf of all the entities. As I mentioned earlier, we had a joint powers agreement with ISD 196 that didn't include all the communities in the county. This study recommended that we look at and partner with all the communities to do that and continue forward on some options to consider. Up to this point, the CDA, Craig Eveling specifically, has been meeting with city councils. He's met with Dakota County board members. He's met with the CDA board members to discuss this effort and discuss the study and the outcomes of the study and what we need to do next and formulate a plan. We're currently working on the formulation of the joint powers agreement that would operate or manage this overall system, the amalgamated system. And what that means is we've got fiber in this community, Egan has fiber, other communities have fiber. How do we combine and join all those systems together and then manage those things collectively? And to a scale that saves us effort, saves us maintenance, saves us money going forward. And then how can we use that to enhance, again, broadband services? One of the things that also was identified in the study is that fiber optic networks are now being viewed as basic infrastructure. It used to be fiber optic infrastructure wasn't considered a basic infrastructure like a road or a street, a water utility. It's now becoming more common to refer to fiber optic infrastructure as basic infrastructure that's necessary. Also, the FCC just recently defined fiber optic broadband infrastructure as a utility. So that really does change what we consider and what we think about fiber optic infrastructure. We continue our discussions not only to partner in order to strengthen our collaboration, but also one of the outcomes of the study recommended looking at leveraging that infrastructure not only for public use but for commercial use. And the idea would be any excess capacity that's still available in that infrastructure could be potentially used by commercial entities like other internet service providers, technology companies, other businesses within those communities that could connect to it and take advantage of those high quality infrastructure. Now I'll slow down on this one just to give you, it's a little diagram that gives you a sense of what kind of system is being considered. This is a typical type of what we would call broadband network. And what you can focus on is at the core of the network where it says core network. This is a ring or what we would consider a core. The idea would be the study recognized the groups could create a core that others could tie into and deliver services over to reach other parts of the communities. So as you see here in the north side of the core, you could tie in here and deliver a service necessarily maybe to the side. These could represent businesses, homes. These could represent other public entities or other groups that could eventually do that. Essentially, the fiber that we have in place today in most areas could be built to deliver this core service. Then others could use it to deliver services to other parts of the community. And I'll refer back to this later on as we go through a few more slides. Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what's being considered as part of the recommendations from the study by Design 9 is to consolidate or enhance those existing networks, or what we call INETs, institutional networks, and look at combining them, tying them together to make them more efficient, leverage connectivity between organizations. And again, I'm referring to public organizations at this point when we refer to INETs. And then supplement where there might be gaps in those connections. So the study went as far as looking at all the fiber optic infrastructure that all the public entities own in the county, and they identified deficiencies or areas that we might need to fill the gaps in order to make this consolidated INET that can deliver better services to our own groups. Then beyond that, once an institutional network is in place that's enhanced and meeting our needs, we could then consider creating a commercial network, a CNET as it's being called, and making that excess capacity available for others to use for commerce, and enhance areas where maybe the service providers aren't providing service, where they aren't delivering infrastructure. And as part of this, in order to go forward, again, referencing the Joint Powers Agreement again, we'd have to have a Joint Powers Agreement and a governance model in place that could manage both the institutional network, the INET, and the CNET, the commercial network. Having that body in place would allow us to manage the entire thing as one entity rather than each individual management that we do today. Each city manages their own networks, and we have staff and we have agreements in place that allows us to do that. Part of the design of the network would be creating it as what we call a wholesale or open access network. And what that means is that government would not provide any direct retail or business services to the residents or businesses. We wouldn't essentially compete with the service providers. We would just allow them to use the infrastructure that's in place to enhance their own services and deliver their services in areas of the county that aren't currently served or underserved. It would be, think of it as a public partnership where they would be able to tie into the public assets, use them for commercial purposes, pay us for those uses, but the cities and the group, the joint powers, would not deliver a internet service or a video service. We wouldn't do that. We would just own the infrastructure and manage that infrastructure to allow others to use it. One of the other outcomes of this is to try to bring, if you've ever heard the term the last mile, getting the fiber closer to residents and businesses. In many cases, if you're a resident or a business that have asked to connect up to a network or broadband system, sometimes you might experience, and we've experienced this ourselves, where your facilities are too far away from the other facilities, so it becomes cost prohibitive. By providing some of the public assets that are closer to facilities, these companies could then deliver services without having to expend a lot of capital dollars to do that themselves. They could use their public assets to do that. And again, one of the goals is to make it more possible for more broadband and more internet service providers to come into the market, to provide more choices, to provide more competitive rates, to provide faster and better quality services. Those are many of the outcomes that we hope for in the effort. Just to give you an idea of what exists today in the county, these are several of the groups that are involved right now in this initiative. These represent the existing fiber assets in the county that would be part of this overall system. The largest owner of fiber assets today is Dakota County. They have 122 miles throughout the county of fiber assets connecting county facilities, city facilities, and some facilities. Plus, they're adding 60 more miles of fiber this year alone in their capital plan. A lot of their efforts are around traffic management, signal management, building management, facility interconnections. The City of Burnsville actually owns 27 miles of fiber. We have fiber in place that connects all of our water utility system, city facilities today, and other facilities that we partner with other entities on. This is just a high-level overview of a map of Burnsville, and the purple line that you see there is an indication of all of our fiber assets that the city owns today. As you can see, as I mentioned earlier, that ring topology or that core, you can see a couple rings here where there are circles that interconnect, and that's an important thing because that provides a path that can be routed in two directions. So if a cut occurs in that fiber optic infrastructure, it's self-healing. The technology allows us to reroute traffic around the other side of the ring. And that's the whole concept behind creating this county-wide ring, where we would use the same kind of concept to provide a resilient network that others could leverage and depend on working. In our case, this is our institutional network today that connects just City of Burnsville facilities. So some of the concerns that came out of the study that were highlighted, and of course they highlighted many statistics in that study. The the overall indication was communication networks are growing at an exponential rate on a regular basis. The study even suggests that it's growing and doubling every 2 years. And it's not, again, just the internet services that you would normally consume. It's the HD, the Netflix, the Hulu, all the other services that are gaining a lot of momentum that are driving the need for faster, better speeds. The report also concludes that the needs of the county businesses and residents are not being adequately addressed at this point from a county-wide perspective. Maybe in pockets of areas they are, but an overall assessment of the county in that study indicated that they're not being adequately met today with the current providers that are in town. Part of it, too, is what's driving this. Are we losing local and global competition to other areas that are doing these things, that are building these types of infrastructure, that deliver faster, long-speed, future-proof type of networks? And I didn't mention it earlier, but when we talk about fiber infrastructure, fiber is a 30 to 50-year infrastructure. So once it's in place, it's a long-term infrastructure. It still needs to be maintained, but it doesn't have to be rebuilt at the same pace or level that maybe a city street would have to be rebuilt. It's a very long-term infrastructure once it's in place. There's also indication that from an economic development standpoint, Dakota County's lost some opportunities for some large-scale businesses that were looking for locations within Dakota County that have lost to other competing counties around us or other states. And some of that has the indications have been because in areas that they were interested in Dakota County, there wasn't broadband infrastructure that could suffice for their needs long term or in the immediate term too. One of the examples that was highlighted recently by Craig in some of his community meetings was Wisconsin has a very active economic development statewide group that maps out many things that businesses can look at when they're looking for locations in Wisconsin. And one of them that they map out is communication networks. Where can I go in Wisconsin to get really high-speed gigabit access? And the map that's publicly accessible on their website identifies what they call gigabit business parks in Wisconsin. As you can see, there's quite a few here indicating the different locations. The different colors indicate the different speeds or levels of broadband available. It's things like this or competitive efforts like this that the group and the study indicated are drawing away possibility of having these same companies come into Dakota County. Some of the references or what is the big deal, and some of the references and studies that they referenced in the overall study. They indicated that McKinsey Global Small and Medium Enterprise Survey suggested that 2.6 jobs are being created for every 1 job lost due to the internet. The GDP growth in fiber-rich communities is 1.1% higher than comparable fiber-poor communities. And what we mean by fiber-poor is communities that either don't have any fiber optic infrastructure or have very little fiber optic infrastructure. And then communication networks are now seen as an important factor in locating decisions. So where we locate is important based on more broadband infrastructure. Another research study that they referenced under Render research study, and consulting that showed that homes served with fiber optics have a value of $5,000 to $6,000 more than comparable homes with conventional services. And when we talk about conventional service, we're talking about standard cable modem service or DSL service, copper-based services that are traditional these days. Some of the recommendations, again, that came out of the study that indicates some steps that we can take. And I referenced earlier, is expanding that institutional network, connecting it together, tying it together to reduce our overall costs. Also then looking at the use of that excess capacity for commercial network use that could become a revenue generator, potentially, that could pay for the system and the maintenance of the system. Some of the other references or information that was provided in the study, that it indicated that county businesses and residents will pay $14 billion over the next 10 years for communication network services. The issue becomes, how do we use this infrastructure to make them most effective. So there's money that's being spent on the infrastructure that's in place today, and that's where this figure came from, is if it's remained the same, what is the dollar amount going to look like 10 years from now that we're spending on the infrastructure we have today? And what I'm referring to in terms of infrastructure, that's all broadband services countywide, DSL, cable, and fiber optic services. Over 300 communities nationally are commercializing public-owned fiber networks like we're talking about tonight. The unique thing about it is not, in this process, one of the things we've learned over this last several months is the models that are being used to build these type of solutions or these type of networks aren't the same. It's unique to every group or every organization. And it's one of the things that we're struggling with is, obviously it's easier to work from a model that exists, but everything is unique. There's some things that we can gather from other models, but we're taking this methodically and slowly so that we can just have good discussions and do it correctly. One of the other things that the study indicated was that the private sector is not making the upgrades or the investments at a pace that we would necessarily like to see. One of the things we can say is that over the course of those 20 years that I've worked on broadband initiatives, that is one thing that we've seen, is that the pace that we would like to see these providers work at isn't quite met with what we would hope for. That's through our continued discussion with them. That's with our continued meetings with them. We understand the challenges, but they're also looking at a very quick return on that investment in their capital infrastructure. Some additional benefits. I didn't talk necessarily about specific benefits of an institutional network that we're discussing. Again, the umbrella management, having one management group managing the overall network, sharing fiber, the ability to, when you need some additional fiber to connect buildings, we can go to a group that will do that on our behalf. One-stop management. Each of our organizations today are managing our own infrastructure and managing our own assets. Now we would have an overall umbrella group that would do that for us. And then overall reducing the cost of the fiber maintenance and the asset management, and then developing the commercial network. I mentioned some of these benefits of a commercial network earlier. The idea is a recruitment tool, the revenue streams potentially that could help pay for it, ongoing, and continue further private investment and partnerships to help build it out. Some of the next steps that are going forward right now, each organization is contributing staff time to this effort to form a framework for a joint powers agreement. On an ongoing basis, meetings are happening, like the meeting tonight, with elected officials to discuss this effort, to talk about it, what it means, where it's going. The hope with that is that we would have a JPA created, Joint Powers Agreement created, sometime by the end of this year, early 2016. Provide an update to the elected officials so that they can consider it for adoption and moving forward. And then after that, once adopted and move forward, start an implementation process that could bring the effort forward. I talked a lot. I talked about a lot of details. I'm here to discuss any questions or any additional clarification you may need in regards to this effort. Essentially, I'm a participant of the effort. I'm on a subcommittee today that is discussing the framework of the Joint Powers Agreement. As you probably could tell, I'm more on the technical side, and my subcommittee focuses on the technical nature of the institutional network and the C network that we can roll into the language of the Joint Powers Agreement to make sure we're covering all of our bases going forward. Beyond that, this will be discussed at the city, county administrator level to be brought forward to the elected officials for their consideration and adoption in the near future.
Joint powers agreement would be between entities throughout the county. What entities?
Primarily the local cities in Dakota County themselves.
And what specific people? The city councils from those groups, or appointed people? Who would make up that group?
That would be part of the framework of the joint powers. It hasn't been finalized, but the discussion would be, it may be made up of staff from each organization and elected officials of each organization, similar to other joint powers agreements that are in place today. That would be the points of discussion that are continuing to go forward that haven't been finalized yet at this point, but that could be a possible membership makeup.
Has there been lobbying by private enterprise to say, hey, we need some better, because obviously they're not willing to invest personally because their investment is lacked based on what you just presented. It sounds like this might be more of a municipality initiative, but has there been some lobbying by private sector to say, hey, we need to expand our broadband and we need to have better infrastructure in place for our customers? Or is this more of a city-driven initiative? Because based on the slide, the cost analysis probably doesn't make sense for private investment, and so there needs to be a public-private partnership, which concerns me because public-private partnerships often can mean freebies for private enterprise at the cost of taxpayers, and so that's the only thing that I, as playing devil's advocate to this initiative, saw as an outcome of this presentation.
Most of the broadband providers today in town or around the group are not lobbying for this type of an effort. It's more of an effort on the public entities standpoint to try to enhance the level of broadband services throughout Dakota County. But we're looking for and seeking partners that would be willing to take advantage of that infrastructure and partner with us on that infrastructure to the point where we may even go forward with, when we talked about an umbrella management group, it could possibly be a private firm that manages the entire infrastructure on behalf of the public JPA members.
How does this differ from the antitrust litigation that took place in the 80s with the telephone companies where they had portions of counties and cities, et cetera, as essentially monopolies? Is this technology allowable in a sense that where the city would host it and then maybe just private enterprise could pocket it? Because it's a little more automated and more virtual than, say, a telephone line. And so one of the things I could see happening is where the city essentially is charging a fee to private ISPs to where they're just finding customers. And then at that point, there's still some competitive forces, but the city is benefiting from better service and actually creating a little bit of a, not profit center, but a self-sustaining cost, driver.
Commissioner, the joint powers would allow us to sell it as a wholesale infrastructure. We would not provide, the intent would be not to provide a service, just the infrastructure. Think of it as a road. We're providing the road or the transportation to allow other service providers to get on and provide a service in an area that today they may not have infrastructure in, but they need to get from point A to point B, and we're in the middle, and they just need to tie into us to get to that other end point. So we're providing them essentially fiber optic infrastructure that's not, as we call, lit necessarily, or potentially not lit up, meaning it doesn't have any electronics hooked up to it. We're allowing them to hook up their own electronics to it so they can deliver whatever service that they want to deliver across that infrastructure.
So you're renting out the infrastructure.
We're renting out the infrastructure.
But unlike the telephone companies, this is a situation where you wouldn't have to have preferential providers. You could just open it up to all but private business and just say, here's our cost. You guys find a way to make money and find customers.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, correct.
Is that unlimited?
Potentially.
Any business could join, or do you have to pick and choose?
Well, there's several schools of thought in that regard. I mean, we're obviously not that far down the road to have that level of discussion, but we've had some of that discussion. There's a few models out there that would think that, or lead you to believe that, have as many service providers on there as possible, so that competitiveness can occur and you can drive down rates and provide services and provide consumers a choice or multiple choices. Another school of thought says, you're going to lower the quality by doing that because now you're not going to be able to manage the number of those numbers. And when we talk about those numbers, we're talking about more than a dozen or more service providers. So we're not at a point where we've identified how many could potentially use the network, but definitely I think the focus right now is on a smaller number and then growing as the potential uses. We can see the measurement, we can measure things, we can see how the uses and how we can manage it. So again, we don't have that level of detailed discussion yet.
So can I ask, let's throw out just an example, so I think just from my own understanding. AT&T UVerse and Verizon Fios, right? Two examples of commercially available service that runs on fiber optic cable, as I understand it. So they have the option, they could build fiber optic cable right now in Dakota County if they wanted to, which they're not because it's too expensive or there are other reasons. Based on the research that's been done, I mean, how do they typically enter a market? What other alternatives are there? Are they using renting fiber optic from counties, or typically does that not happen? Or
Well, there's examples of that around the country that where it is occurring. In many cases, especially in this area, we're not seeing a lot of that, where a private provider, a large private provider, might be renting public assets to do some of that. But there are some local examples. I can speak to that just because Burnsville is doing some of that today on our own. As part of our fiber initiative in 2008 for our water utility system, we built out fiber through that map that I displayed earlier. As part of that, the City Council directed staff to look at any excess capacity that we have in our system and lease or license that to private providers or public entities that would benefit from the use of that, and we're doing that today. We have several agreements in place today that where we're providing what we call backhaul services, getting that company connected to our fiber infrastructure to get them to like a cellular tower where they can provide wireless service off that cellular tower. So there's some examples of that today. Definitely there's companies out there that aren't interested in using anybody else's assets or infrastructure other than their own. But there's many, many companies out there that are willing to use others. We actually have a couple companies in town today that would have indicated that they would take advantage of this infrastructure if it were to go forward. And in many cases, they are taking advantage of it. They're just taking advantage of it only in pocketed areas of the county right now. Egan, I don't know if you've kept up on what Egan has been doing. The city of Egan has a network ring today where they do provide a wholesale model where they're allowing service providers to tie in and deliver their service over that ring of fiber, and they're selling that today. So that's actually a very similar model to what the county-wide initiative is modeling ourselves after, is what the city of Egan has already done.
What is the city of Egan's metric in terms of who's allowable in that bidding process? Have they handpicked 3 or 4 providers, or is it an open?
It's an open access today,
Okay.
and it's a non-exclusive access today. So as far as I know, the last time I talked to my counterpart at Egan, they had 5 providers on that system today.
With no limits?
With no limits, yeah.
Fiber optic, I would assume it's been talked about, is that, you say it could last 40, 50 years as opposed to a road or something. Is the technology going to change on that, where fiber optic is no longer the latest, greatest?
The fiber itself will not change, but what will connect to the ends of the fiber changes. That's the benefit of the fiber. So the fiber bandwidth, the speed that we get out of fiber today, is only limited by the electronics that we hook up to each end of it. And the electronics that we use today are laser technology. It's laser light because fiber optics is glass. And basically it shoots a laser across that glass, in many, many cases, many miles. So the fiber technology, the raw fiber itself, the picture you see up on your screen today, that's actually fiber optics. And what you're seeing there is multiple strands of fiber optics. All it takes is 2 of those strands to really send an enormous amount of data in long, long distances. And when we talk distances, we're talking miles. In our case, we have 27 miles worth of fiber. In many cases, we're shooting laser lights beyond 10 miles to get from one point to another. Our benefit is we know that the fiber is going to be in place for the next 30 to 50 years, potentially, if we take care of it well. And all we have to do is budget and maintain the electronics that we hook up to it on each end. And there's a life cycle on the electronics, and today the life cycles are roughly 5 to 7 to 10 years, depending on what you have in place. But beyond that, the fiber itself is I won't call it future-proof, but it's long-term infrastructure.
You spoke a little bit about what the public infrastructure is like. Do you have any information of what the private infrastructure is? How many miles of cable they own in the area?
We have a general sense. Obviously, we have some sense of where private fiber is based on the right-of-way permits that they've pulled over the years. Going back several years, though, there hasn't been a lot of documentation. There's a proactive approach. We have information on private provider fiber going back a few decades, but earlier than that, we don't have a lot of information. And it's community by community. So it depends on how well a community itself has maintained or monitored that fiber. In many cases, they're disjointed fiber runs by private providers where they're just getting from one point to another point in the city and don't have a comprehensive network. But those are also opportunities we see going forward with this effort where we could possibly interconnect this system with that private fiber and lease out that private fiber if it provides us a better network and a network that can be sold and partnered on. So those are considerations that are part of this discussion also.
So touching back on, I guess, that control question, right now, Egan and Burnsville, they have their own ring that they control. So Egan decided to open it up, anybody can use it. If the JPA is approved and ultimately all of these rings become interconnected over time, does that mean that each city loses independence in making decisions as to who can or can't access their own ring, and that becomes a JPA decision? Or is there still some sort of level of city control that they can exercise?
The answer is yes. Yeah. Those are all part of the discussions that we're having in the
Sure.
JPA. So it's a very complicated JPA because as part of it, and Burnsville City Council has also made it very clear, we want to continue to own our assets and our infrastructure. We would not give over that infrastructure to the Joint Powers Agreement. What we essentially would do is provide, and the discussion has been an IRU, a right-to-use agreement over a several number of years that would give the JPA the ability to use the infrastructure that we've identified as excess capacity. So we could say only a portion of our infrastructure can be used for the Joint Powers Agreement. The other infrastructure is still going to be dedicated for city use only. So in a sense, it still gives us that control. And other groups have indicated similar wishes and needs in the same regard. Because the idea would be that the joint powers needs to be flexible enough to allow the members to enter and leave if it doesn't work out in their favor any longer. Now, the caveat to that is obviously there may be some dependency on these networks to make the whole ring viable or workable. So we still have to work through those details, but those are all pieces of the discussion that we are having currently.
Do you anticipate that also means cities could impose conditions on how their excess optics could be used, or can or can't be used, or how
Potentially, if the joint powers allows for that, if the language in the joint powers would allow for that. And right now, the intention in the discussions we are having is not gone that direction. There's some concern and reservations, obviously, about we all want to make sure our needs are met first, our operational needs for city operations. So we don't want to put that at risk, and the joint powers language has to address that in some fashion that would not put that at risk.
Does the JPA, is it simply intended to create the framework, or is there a particular goal as to coverage and over a particular period of time, and are there been dollars already discussed as to the financing required to make that happen?
The framework, it would be a framework to work
Okay,
within,
only. Okay.
and then a management group that could help manage the assets. That's one of the things that we do struggle with today is the amount of time and resources that we have to put towards managing that infrastructure and making sure that it's viable infrastructure for that long duration. I spend a lot of my time on that infrastructure, making sure, because the normal activities occur, the backhoes that dig up the streets, the lightning strikes that may down a pole that digs up fiber, those things all take somebody's time to manage and maintain and fix. And the joint powers would do that on our behalf. At least that's the intent at this point, where the cities could go back to working on what we feel is unnecessary pieces of our operation and let the joint powers manage the overall umbrella. But the joint powers, we feel, will evolve into other areas. And kind of getting to your second point, could it potentially help define where we need to do a better job of expanding infrastructure? Absolutely. We've had those similar discussions. Where could we partner with private providers to continue that expansion? We feel that the joint powers could provide us, especially if it's staffed with knowledgeable people on this type of infrastructure, where they could focus solely on that effort. and not each city having to have a, part of it too is the coordination of effort, right? We today are all doing our own things with our own infrastructure, and that's really what one of the biggest pieces of this recognition of going forward was we need a coordinated effort because we're all trying to do similar things, but we're doing it in different time frames, and we're doing it at different, where we could take and leverage opportunities that we are not seeing, where the joint powers could see all of us in an umbrella framework and say, oh, we see constructions going on in this part of the county. There's an opportunity for us to maybe put in fiber infrastructure that another city wasn't even aware of. It's those opportunities missed that we hope that the JPA will help us with.
It seems to me that Burnsville has spent a lot of money on the fibers that we have, and probably Egan, but the rest of Dakota County has not. So what is Burnsville going to gain by joining a group where everything else has to be built? All of the monies would go towards building all of, it's like we have our own roads, but nobody else has them. We'd have to build all these roads in all these communities. Dakota County is huge. What do we gain? I have no problem with commercializing ours, but what do we gain by joining the group?
Part of the roadmap for the joint powers agreement is defining a revenue model that would recognize the assets and the participants' assets that have brought more forward in this effort. So the idea would be we could identify or place a percentage on how much assets are owned by each entity, and the revenue share would reflect that so that we do get our fair share, because that is a concern. That's a concern that not only from a staff level that was brought up, but from a council level was brought up too, to make sure that we're protecting our assets, that we're paying for our assets through this effort, and that we're gaining benefit from this. There's an overall arching benefit of interconnecting ourselves with the rest of the county, and the efforts that we may be able to bring forward in the future, like shared services, network services that today we each build ourselves. So those are some of the intangible things that will come out of this initially, but in terms of protecting our assets and make sure our fair share is in place, that's definitely part of the joint powers agreement discussion.
Would that include, I mean, if I understand the technical aspect of all of this, the more rings you add or connect, the stronger the system. So
Correct.
Even though Burnsville has its own ring, if that ring can be part of a much larger interconnected ring, that strengthens both, that ensures more speed, wider use, and increases redundancies in the system should something fail. There's technical benefits to having a wider ring than what Burnsville has now.
Absolutely.
Is that how I understand
Absolutely. We obviously do have a lot of assets in place because some of the earlier initiatives we took on in the last several years. Obviously, one of the things, and I brought this slide back up because one of the things you can see here too is Dakota County actually owns the most assets. They actually have the most in this process. They're more than willing to work through those discussions, and although they own the most assets today, they recognize that there's gaps in their assets that by tying our ring to theirs, to Egan's, to Apple Valley's, to Lakeville and other entities, their overall system is going to be a benefit. Obviously, we want to recognize the benefit that they bring forward through some kind of revenue share that will cover their costs and give them a percentage that is fair. So again, we're having those discussions. We're not down to all the details yet. That's still several weeks or months away from having more of that information. And that's, in a sense, is what's going to be brought back to the elected officials. There's going to be obviously attorneys involved. There's going to be elected officials involved in that process. And we all have to come to agreement. The joint power also is not a requirement. There's an initial membership, but the initial membership allows for early exit if an entity feels that it is not in their benefit and it's not going a direction that they feel comfortable with. So definitely we're looking at all aspects of this so that we're not overcommitting anything that would tie the city into a long-term relationship that would give up anything that would be detrimental to us.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. One of the questions I think the council may like to get some input from this commission on is, does the Economic Development Commission see this as a viable retention and attraction tool going forward, and should we aggressively go forward with this, or should we take a more cautious approach, which is actually what council's direction has been right now, is for us to take a cautious approach. I think if the commission could give them any input on the economic development aspect of a tool like this, they would find that beneficial.
My question is, you were talking about these unused lines. They're not lit lines. Currently, those would be the ones you'd be looking to rent or lease out to commercial entities. Would they be renting a line or a certain bandwidth? How would that go out? And then if there was more demand for more, would you look to expand, more drops?
Yes, to all those. Essentially, we're looking at a couple different things. One would be renting bandwidth. That gets back to similar to what Egan's doing today. They have this lit ring service where once you connect up to it, you get a certain amount of bandwidth that you pay for and you receive to provide services to others. In Burnsville's case today, we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're leasing you strands of fiber or dark fiber that's not connected to any assets so that you can connect your own facilities to them. So those two models exist today in the county, and we're trying to meld both of those models into the joint powers so that we could accommodate both types of requests. And then going forward, we're also looking at the joint powers having some abilities to help finance this potentially to build out where we need to build out more abilities. And again, those get into more of the details of the joint powers that's not completed yet. But again, touching base on the three things that you mentioned, yes, all three are being discussed today.
You talked about you're leasing some of those lines to private enterprise currently.
Mm-hmm.
What's an example of somebody that's using that technology?
Sure. So today we've got companies in town that are licensing our fiber. We call it licensing, not leasing. It's a similar thing, but we license the fiber to a company called TTMI, and they are a backhaul provider for cellular companies. So the cell towers that you see all over the place are interconnected via fiber optic cable. That fiber optic cable offloads all that wireless information that comes in on the cell tower and then delivers it via the fiber optics back to their corporate network centers. And we have a company today that is leasing fiber from one point in the city, 12th Avenue, the corner of 12th Avenue and Cliff Road, all the way up to our Heather Hills tower site, to the cell towers that are on the Heather Hills water tower. That's one example. We also have a couple public entities that are licensing our fiber. The Minnesota Valley Transit Authority today on Nicollet and Highway 13 is licensing fiber from the city to provide them network services. That fiber connects to their network, and we deliver their access to their internet service provider through our fiber today. So that's a public entity. We're also licensing our fiber to the state of Minnesota today for the Minnesota Workforce Center down on County Road 42. So the deed center that's operated by the Department of Economic Development today is operating on City of Burnsville fiber. We actually have in excess of 6 agreements today for city fiber that's going between public and private partners. And today
so it is definitely an asset. I mean,
Well, and I think the question is, you talked about the community being underserved. The council has taken a cautious approach to this, which only can mean that they're looking at the cost and looking at the needs of the community, and really mainly the private sector, which hasn't seen the need to invest into anything to this type of initiative. And so when you say underserved, I guess my and being the cynic, you're concerned with taxpayers providing free internet and free broadband to vast communities, and that's really the cynic in me, but that's probably the concerns of many of the residents and taxpayers of this community. If the private sector doesn't see an underserved infrastructure, because it, at least from a cost analysis, isn't, what's the cost, assuming no private enterprise really jumps on board and there's no money being made on the renting out of this infrastructure, and it's really just a municipality goodie? What's the cost, and what is it going to add? I mean, that's probably why the council's taken I haven't talked to any of the members of the council on this issue, but I know them all pretty well, and I can only assert that that's what they're their reasoning for being cautious is if no private enterprise beyond the one that you indicated in other municipalities where other taxpayers are paying for Burnsville infrastructure are the only real customers of this broadband, what is the actual additional cost to the taxpayers of Burnsville, mainly the businesses, because this is a commercial, community?
Today, essentially, the fiber optic obviously was put in place in our case for a city operational need and our water infrastructure. And our council initially obviously identified that the excess capacity existed that we could utilize for other purposes, but we still needed to make sure we pay for the infrastructure we use. And our cost today for that infrastructure essentially is maintenance costs. And the maintenance I refer to is when the lines get cut by the backhoes I mentioned earlier, or we have to move those assets because of road construction project or a utility project, there's costs associated with those. So those are the costs for today. And one of our goals going forward with the joint powers process is that those costs would be neutral. They wouldn't increase. We hopefully would see a decrease in them because now we're scaling to a larger size that we could have more buying power as a larger group rather than just a single city. So the overall goal to bring down those costs could be apparent in that regard. Today, with the leases and the licenses that the city has in place with our fiber, it covers our annual operating expense for our fiber optics. So we see the benefit in doing that. Today, we're cost neutral when it comes to that, other than my staff time to manage that fiber and manage the assets on a regular basis. And we're seeing similar things in the other communities that are doing similar things. That Egan, they're covering a lot of their costs, their annual maintenance. So from a taxpayer standpoint, the asset's already in the ground. We're paying for the maintenance, and if we can cover the maintenance and the ongoing upkeep of that, that's a benefit. Now, anything above and beyond that, as we sell more fiber asset use through this process or through our existing process that we're doing today, we're going to see additional revenue. Anything going forward is going to just be additional revenue to the city. And as long as, I think, in our case, as long as that continues to either maintain or increase, that's a benefit to the city. And that model can be expanded within all those other communities that would be part of the joint powers. Now, reflecting back on one of the earlier comments, some of the communities that have very little fiber, have very little assets, they're going to have a little bit more investment to do in order to leverage and take advantage of this, and they recognize that they're going to have that, but the joint powers is going to help them along in that process without impacting expenses to those existing members, and that's one of the goals of the joint powers.
Tom, why did Burnsville decide to license out dark line versus lit as Egan did? I mean, does that change the cost structure? Does that change who can really afford to license a line versus bandwidth?
Essentially, the model that we chose had little additional investment necessary. Because the asset was already in place, it was just our time in developing the agreements to allow those providers to use that asset. Our costs were covered in that process. When we go through and license or lease our assets, we actually escrow the cost so that the person who wants to lease or license it has to cover our expenses in that process to create those agreements. We chose it just because that was the amount of, we didn't have additional resources to go through a different model at the time that we chose to do that. In the Egan model, they actually had to invest quite a bit of money in order to deliver the lit service that they're providing today.
So my question is, does having a lit service open the door to more potential commercial activity to license that bandwidth than licensing a dark line, or is that all six, one half dozen of the other? What's the kind of the pros and cons of each from a commercial perspective? Because I'm not.
One of the downsides I can talk to in our process, when we license out chunks of our fiber infrastructure, think of it, we're fragmenting our fiber infrastructure. So these rings that I referred to earlier, we may only license part of that ring. So it takes a chunk of fiber out of that overall ring, which makes it no longer available as a ring topology. So that there's a downside to that, where we're carving out pieces of our infrastructure, whereas in the Egan model, they're lighting their entire ring up. So they're not giving anybody any fiber assets. They're just allowing them to hook up to that ring somewhere within the city, and their data travels the entire path of that ring. Where in our model, the data only travels in the path of the licensed fiber that they provide. So it creates some fragmentation of our fiber, and we recognize some of that, but it also, there's providers or broadband companies out there that's all they want. They want just dark fiber, and the reason they want that is they don't want you to put electronics on it that they would then have to depend on us maintaining and making sure delivers a service that they would have to depend on us for. Whereas the dark fiber, they can hook up their own equipment and just use that asset, and they manage it. So that's where having a blended model is being recognized, because there are providers out there that want just strings of fiber and don't want any lit fiber services or any equipment on it. But there are others that do want lit services.
So if you want just dark fiber, the business has to make the investment to use the fiber.
Correct.
Versus if you license lit service, your investment to license that lit service is much less. You just plug in and you can go.
For the most part, you might have to build out a little bit of a lateral, they call it, to the business place. But Eaton's got a model in place where they help fund that build out. And then so the cost of, the capital cost to the service provider may be less up front to do that. So there's some pros in that model because of that. In our case, I can give one example where we had a commercial entity that was within 1,000 feet of our fiber, and they got a cost estimate of what it would cost to extend our a length of fiber to connect to our fiber, and it was too cost prohibitive for them, so they chose not to do that. And those types of things do occur. I mean, there's obviously, we want to make sure we cover the capital expense of extending our fiber, but we're doing it in a way that the service provider has to front some of that money to cover our expenses.
Going to Skip's point, thank you, Tom, for the presentation. The council did want some guidance as to whether they should change their approach from cautious to maybe exploring it a little more aggressively. What were thoughts? I don't know what your thoughts are. I would tend to continue being cautious.
What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty
What does
vague.
cautious mean, and what is more? I mean, both hands on the table pounding, yes, let's do it, or whoa, wait, what does
I
that
think council would also like some input. Does this commission see this as an economic development tool for retention and attraction? And if it is, then we obviously should be moving in a stronger mode. If we're not sure, or we don't see it, then maybe we should be moving very cautiously.
Are there examples? I mean, the mayor is on the board. Is she still on the board of Greater MSP?
Correct.
Okay, so I got to think that the mayor would see tangible examples of
I think what's
companies
more
that come
important-
into Burnsville that say, hey, you don't have a broadband infrastructure that meets our needs, so we're going to Rochester or wherever they're going.
I think the feedback the council is going to be looking for from the commission is, what do you think?
Well, I think you have to look at examples of, are we losing business in Burnsville because we don't have broadband right now in place to meet the needs of the commercial and community, and the commercial community doesn't seem to think so. And so that would tend me to believe that we should be a little more cautious in our approach if it's going to cost taxpayers any money. Now, you had said that it probably isn't going to have that much of an effect perpetually. There might be some initial cost and maybe a few staff members that have to be added, but perpetually I don't think that operating costs are going to be that much different than what we're looking at now. And so I think we have to continue the discussion, and you guys have as much say in this as I do, but I think you have to continue the discussion, certainly. But I don't know if there's any immediate concerns. This is more of a long-term.
Who would we attract, and who would we lose? I don't know who that is.
One example that's been out there and been discussed in some of these other meetings with the CDA and Craig before some of the other elected officials is Emerson. If you're familiar with Emerson, they're a very large company that is in Scott County and Shakopee today. They negotiated and were provided fiber optic infrastructure by the city of Shakopee as the word's been used, enticement to get them to finalize a location in Shakopee. And it's my understanding that they were initially looking at locations in Dakota County early on in their look for locations, and Dakota County lost out to that opportunity.
Was that an expansion, or was that a new business attraction?
A brand new business.
Did they get any like tax abatement or any TIF financing?
It was a combination of things, but what we've been told is that the fiber optic infrastructure that they were provided at no cost in Shakopee was the driving factor that landed them that location. And there's some other examples that Shakopee specifically use in terms of their fiber infrastructure. Scott County is a county that actually built out fiber to every community and every school district facility back in 2007 as part of an effort that they did. And Shakopee is one of the cities that has continued to expand on that fiber institutional network that's in place to attract businesses and economic development in their community. I can't say that that's occurring in other areas of Scott County, but Scott County is one of the examples that's being used.
How many employees do that add?
You know, I don't know specifically.
Because one of the things that we've talked about is Burnsville doesn't have that kind of expansion capability.
A large facility like that.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
so we're a little bit maxed out, and we just need to make sure that everybody that is here is serviced. And that's not entirely an accurate statement, but you know what I mean. Scott County is attractive in some regards because there's the land is there. But so
It's
what?
my sense that we're not losing anything, that and no one's going to come or go based on that. We don't have any potential for any huge buildings or any big I mean,
Not in Burnsville, but.
Not in
Dakota
Burnsville.
County as a whole, probably.
Dakota County does.
Right. And this is the initiative for Dakota County, correct?
Countywide initiative that we would all be participant members of.
Right.
Yep. And the overall benefit would be, obviously, we would like to see more businesses come to Burnsville, but also recognize that as a county as a whole, it would be a benefit to attract businesses and residents throughout the county. How we build out that revenue share is still part of the discussion. How do we identify how they were attracted? But if our assets contribute to the overall assets within the county, there's going to be a cost sharing or a revenue sharing model that would account for that.
You don't list a couple cities, Lakeville, Hastings, a couple cities, they have zero?
They have very little.
Okay.
Very little, but they're also making efforts towards building more out, and they do have some. It just wasn't included in the slide provided by the CDA.
And I would think Lakeville is a huge proponent of something like this because they have a lot of industrial expansion capability and current industrial infrastructure in place on like 50 and some of that.
And they're very active in their broadband efforts down there, too. One of the fortunate things for Lakeville that they did many years ago is they negotiated a bandwidth use agreement with the local cable provider back in the early 2000s. And so the city itself has fiber optic infrastructure that they're utilizing. They do not own it. The cable provider does, which provides some limitations on what they can use it for. They can only use it for public purposes and not commercial purposes. That's one of the flexibilities that we have today with our infrastructure is we can use it for both our own use, public use, and private use because we own it and we manage it and control it. And the Joint Powers Agreement also would identify that as a goal going forward too, that we have to make it available to anybody and everybody to use to be a benefit.
It would be interesting to see the Dakota County map and where the fiber is and how it connects with everybody else. So
The public map or the private map or both?
what we have for Burnsville but on Dakota County level, and like does Lakeville have a bunch of that going down 50 or 70 or?
We do have a map that's a countywide map that was part of the study that I can sure provide to Skip to provide to you, and it actually identifies where the gaps are. And because part of the discussion going forward with the Joint Powers Agreement is we do have to identify and close the gaps to build that solid ring. And how does that get funded and who pays for that, especially if that gap isn't in a community like Burnsville or Egan? Who pays for that, and how do we equally share that if we're all going to benefit from it? So again, that's part of the ongoing discussion that we have to work on.
So what is our recommendation? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you showed that map of Wisconsin and the business parks, and I recently moved there from the northern area where it was a little more sparsely. I mean, their broadband was a huge issue there and limited access to it, and thus, we struggled with development in that part of the state, and they continue to struggle. And so I think anything that Burnsville can do to enhance our broadband network for the future, if it makes sense for, from a taxpayer point of view, I think
Yeah, and this has a lot of correlation to transportation funding, because one of the biggest gripes you get at the state capitol when it comes to transportation funding is the majority of the dollars are collected in more populated areas, and the spending is dispersed more evenly throughout the state. And so that gets to your point, is I think that's a concern, personally, because we could put the greatest broadband up on the Iron Range, and it doesn't solve our problems in Burnsville, and that's what this is getting to, a more regional collaboration. I know it's only a county at this point, but you know where this goes, Tom.
Yeah,
you know how this works in government, and I think that's a red flag to me, because as unfortunate as that might be, that they don't have service up there, they choose to live up there, and we're talking about small pockets of people who have chosen to live in communities that are a little more isolated. And so I think there's got to be a more practical and more or less expensive way to service these people. And in Burnsville, I don't think anybody's underserved. I'm sorry. I think if you have a business in Burnsville, or if you live in a house in Burnsville, you have access to probably some of the highest, most capable internet in the country. Meet?
Well, I mean, I somewhat disagree with you, because I've been in a couple different locations in Burnsville, and getting internet past a T1 is very difficult to get. For example, on the north side of Cliff Road, I don't know if that still exists now, but you can't get high-speed internet. You can get a T1.
But isn't that something we can probably take care of within our city?
Potentially, but I think that currently, I agree with you that fiber is not needed, but over time, I believe that retention of the businesses and expansion is going to become a more and more concern. Like you alluded to or stated, they define that as a utility, and that's going to become a requirement over time.
Yeah, I think we should be aggressively supporting the joint powers agreement. I think it's more about retention of the businesses in Burnsville than the fact that we may not be able to attract any. Because I bet you Lakeville can probably crank out fiber pretty quickly, and if they build their own ring, then we're competing against Lakeville, or we're competing against Egan, or we're competing against Apple Valley. The other issue is this whole kind of dark versus lit. Giving different businesses options as to how they want to license or lease out data is going to be critical. Some businesses are just going to want the fiber, some businesses are just going to want the lit. And there's going to be a point where we're not going to have enough dark fiber to license out. If we're going to increase our bandwidth use, we're going to need the fiber. You can't just give it all away. So to me, and you get to share in the cost, I think the analogy to roads is not necessarily accurate, because there is a revenue generating component to all of this. And obviously,
We hope.
well, there's already for Burnsville and for Egan. So we're going to, I agree.
Well,
How much revenue is it? Yeah, how much?
I'm not
Yeah,
disagreeing
right.
with you in terms of.
Right.
But I'm just saying. I think. So, what is our recommendation to the council?
I would support the joint powers agreement. I think the caution is going to be in the detail, right? So we want to make sure that there's a sustainable revenue model. We want to make sure that whatever is decided, that states maintain some sort of independence over their decision making over their own hardware and how they want to use it. Understanding there's going to be some sort of agreement and
quantifying the cost.
and understanding the cost. But otherwise, I think it's an important agreement. We need the fiber optic. It's going to be needed like a road, like anything else. It already pretty much is. It's just going to be that much more important. So I think it is worth us taking a leadership role, given our size in Dakota County, in pushing for a joint powers agreement, but also making sure that we can get some of the details ironed out that do support Burnsville's interests.
So I would make a motion that we support the council's continued due diligence on the initiative. We quantify the cost analysis a little more. And anybody want to add anything else? And we do see this as a viable planning initiative going forward.
You second that?
Put that in a little more practical terms. I think the quantifiable piece in terms of the monetary
So, Mr.
investment is.
Chair, are you basically seconding Commissioner Cherner's motion, or are you?
Yeah, a little more emphasis. I mean, I don't know exactly how you said it, but
I think we support the JPA.
We do.
However, we want to make sure that there's a strong emphasis and focus on it. There's an understanding as to the cost implications, the revenue implications, and basically the control implications over our existing
And,
network.
and I wouldn't be opposed to finding out a little more as to, and I'm not a guy that says if private enterprise doesn't move forward with something, we can't look at it as a community and be a little more foresight. But I would like to maybe look a little bit into the fact that there hasn't been that private investment. I mean, I think that has to be a part of the discussion when it comes to quantifying the costs. But otherwise, I do think that it's something the council should consider to continue to do some due diligence on and monitor because this is new. This hasn't really been.
It's an expansion
It's
of
an
where we're at.
expansion and it's an experiment, and so I think it's something we don't completely dismiss it, but we don't completely embrace it either.
If I could, Mr. Chair, as I understand the motion, it's to support the JPA efforts, including taking a leadership role on the JPA, but make sure that there is a sustainable model, a dollar model, and that we should also continue to concentrate on the need for private investment.
Is that fair?
Did I
Terrific.
get your, all right, thank you.
Wonderful.
So there, we had a motion.
I'll second.
All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion has been approved.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you.
The greater MSP results, Skip?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This item is the annual discussion of the results from the greater MSP efforts. Just a little quick history to remind you. Greater MSP is a public-private partnership. It encompasses a 16-county area and effort. Basically, it's a focus on retention and attraction of companies to that 16-county area. In the past year, Greater MSP has also embarked on a similar retention and attraction effort for skilled workforce. Basically, how can we keep our college graduates here, and how can we attract additional college graduates? Burnsville, the city of Burnsville was an initial investor in the Greater MSP effort, and we have been an investor every year. Our investment level is $25,000 per year. Your investment level is determined by the population of your municipality or county. And to date, Burnsville has contributed $125,000 to the effort. The results from last year, which just came out about a month ago, is Greater MSP had 28 projects they completed. And for Greater MSP, a project completion is they attracted a business, they helped in a retention of a business, or they assisted in the expansion of a business. And their data shows that in those 28 projects last year, they created an additional 5,025 jobs and brought in a little bit over $500 million worth of capital investment. The 28 projects occurred in 18 cities within the 16-county area, and 5 of those 18 cities were investors, as Burnsville is, in the Greater MSP effort. 10 of those projects were actually in the 5 in the investor cities, and 6 of those 10 projects were actually in the city of Minneapolis. Minneapolis was a huge benefiter of the Greater MSP efforts last year. In the period of time in which Greater MSP has been in play and we have been an investor, the city of Burnsville has actually never seen a completed project. We have attracted no businesses to Burnsville via the Greater MSP efforts. We are in the process of, we think, retaining a business in Burnsville with some help from Greater MSP. And we'll probably know the finality of that sometime this year. And with that, I would stand for any questions regarding the Greater MSP efforts or any comments that the Commission may have.
We've, in the past, we've supported this initiative as a commission just because the investment annually is fairly low. And we've gotten much more in-depth presentations on this initiative. Any thoughts to any folks that are seeing this for the first time?
This possible retention, Skip, any estimate as to what percentage the greater MSP is helping to retain the business?
Commissioner, the original effort of Greater MSP was to assist the business in leaving Burnsville. After discussions with Greater MSP on the efforts that Burnsville was making with said business to retain it, Greater MSP did take a look at the possible places an expansion could occur for the business, and did side with Burnsville that those were some good options. Greater MSP also did engage Deed at that point, and Deed was willing to put forth some of their job creation fund money on the table, as Burnsville had put a TIF possibility on the table for the business. Quite frankly, at that point, everything kind of just went dormant for a while, and we believe that the business now has a model they are going to pursue, and that model does include the current facility staying in Burnsville, and there may be an expansion, and that expansion could actually occur outside of Burnsville. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's kind of the background. And at this point, we need to keep the business in question confidential.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding you correct, and did you have anything else? Sorry.
No,
I
go ahead.
guess if I'm understanding you correct, they went to Greater MSP, and Greater MSP initially advised them to leave Burnsville for a different
No,
city.
if I gave you that impression, Mr.
That's
Chair,
the way I understood it initially. And that's, yeah, they're not in their
They
heads, so, okay.
they went to Greater MSP,
Okay.
and they said, we would like your help in finding a location to expand. And Greater MSP then engaged in their normal policy of disseminating that information across the 16-county area. When that was disseminated, the city of Burnsville was in discussions with that business, and those discussions included the TIF incentives we were willing to give for the business to expand here. Staff did contact Greater MSP and say, we have options in Burnsville, for the business, that you've just disseminated this information on. And then in discussions between city staff and Greater MSP staff, it was determined that there were some viable options. So they somewhat put the brakes on this huge effort and focused more with us on how we could retain the business here in Burnsville.
Is there any way to know if the new 5,025 new jobs tied to Burnsville residents or anyone from South Metro or anything like that?
There probably is a way that at some point you could drill down. What literally would have to happen is Greater MSP would have to ask each one of these companies for the zip codes of the new employees. But more than I can tell you that a few years ago, when we worked with UTC Aerospace, which at the time was Goodrich, on one of their expansions, the city did, with Deed's help, get a tax rebate for that expansion. And one of the questions of the legislators was, how broad-based do they pull for an employee base? And we did request that information from UTC Aerospace, and quite frankly, it was rather amazing as to how far away some of their employees came. Now, that is a company that hires predominantly engineers. So I do think some of these bigger projects, when they are brought into the region, the likelihood of a Burnsville resident possibly working there is a reasonable likelihood. The other piece that should not be overlooked is every business that comes into the county is also a potential customer for a Burnsville business. Even though we do not get one of these businesses, there are some ancillary benefits that we can derive.
Out of the 28 projects, how many of them included some abatement or TIF?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I don't have the answer to that question.
Because it seems to me like that's almost become a prerequisite to attracting anything significant, and it's a little disturbing, but it'd be interesting to see how many of those 28 new, because I remember the UTC, or at the time Goodrich discussion at the chamber level, and that was a big piece of that discussion. The NEAT knows that too, and so I'm wondering.
I can tell you that there was a huge retention in the city of Lakeville last year with Greater MSP's help that had absolutely no incentives connected to it. As a matter of fact, it was kind of presented as that is a possibility.
Sure.
There were a lot of other factors why the company decided to stay in Lakeville.
So it's a $25,000 annual investment.
Who are the 18 cities?
I'm sorry.
Who in the immediate area? Lakeville is one?
Lakeville was on there. Last year, I believe Lakeville might have been the only Dakota County city that had one of their projects. Right. Egan in the past has gotten a couple. Apple Valley has had one in one of the years. And I believe that is all of the cities in Dakota County, Commissioner. And there are 5 cities in Dakota County that are contributors.
If memory serves me correct, just to give everybody that hasn't been on this commission that long a little background, when the MSP, Greater MSP Commission is not specific to those members. I mean, they are here to promote the Twin Cities, whether your city is a member or not. And so sometimes communities will decide to give the investment every other year, or every third year or whatnot. Now, Burnsville has been consistent for 5 years. It's a very small annual cost, but just because you're paying doesn't mean that they're going to give you preferential treatment in their promotion of the Twin Cities.
That is
and so that
correct,
it's again, it's a very small sliver of the city's budget. We have a mayor that's on the board, and so she's certainly a great advocate for the city. It would be my recommendation, and I would motion that we support the $25,000 a year, but continue to see slides like this. And if Burnsville has never had a completed project and we've been in this for 10 years, maybe we step aside for a year and say, well, let's see what. Go ahead.
It bothers me that they went out, put the full
that bothers
Monty
me
out,
too,
and
as a member.
without did staff ask them why they didn't talk to Burnsville first?
No preferential treatment.
They were already here.
Commissioner, basically what occurred is the staff at Greater MSP had a policy at the time that if a company approached them asking for help in expansion or relocation, and told them that they did not want the cities that they were currently located in to know that they were looking, Greater MSP had a policy that they would follow that initiative. The staff at Greater MSP believed that that is what occurred when the company approached them. There obviously was a miscommunication because we were obviously deeply in discussions with them. That has actually resulted in a policy change at Greater MSP. The new policy reads that Greater MSP will basically tell a company, we believe the first thing you should do, and we would help you do that, is contact the city that you're in and see if they can help you. If for some reason the company definitely does not want that to happen, then the policy reads that Greater MSP will contact the city, tell them that they are working with a company in their city that is probably going to leave, and that the company has requested that they not tell the city who they are, but at least let the city know that Greater MSP is working with them. It's a very tenuous line. I mean, their mission as a regional organization is to attract and retain businesses in the region. And I think they need to be able to do that. Obviously, those of us at the city level do not like to see us lose a business. If it's a case, and this has happened before in our case, there are some times where physically we don't have the building or the land for the business to expand to. and we lose them. I think with the new policy, the lines of communication will be a little bit better. This was just a case where somewhere along the line there was a piece of miscommunication, and that line, got a little murky for a while. But the end result actually is Greater MSP probably has a better policy now than they used to have.
Okay, so we don't have to actually take an action on this,
On
this presentation. This is,
you do not have to, but if you do, if the EDC wants to make a recommendation that we continue to support the investment, that certainly would be.
do I have a motion of any kind regarding this topic?
I'll give a discussion instead of a motion. If the Burnsville mayor is on the board of the greater MSP, I think it would behoove us to recommend that we spend the $25,000.
I'll make a motion to support it.
I would second that motion. All in favor, say aye.
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 Motion approves. Developer panel update. Skip.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you may recall, in March, we had 3 developer building owners of Burnsville address the commission. We asked them some questions about, what are the positives that you see when you talk to tenants? What are some of the hurdles you encounter, and should we be doing some other things? The direction from the commission after that meeting was to bring back to you some tools that other cities use besides TIF and tax abatement. Take a look at, are there ways for our zoning to be a little less rigid and open to new users? And then specifically on Heart of the City, to maybe have a joint EDC Planning Commission meeting in which we would kind of look at the heart of the city and see if there are some new things we should be doing. What I'd like to do first of all is recap for the commission some of the types of tools that other cities do use in lieu of TIF or tax abatement. Minneapolis is very good at creating what they call business districts, and in these districts they will make grants or loans available to businesses that will either move into that district and or grow or renovate in that district. Typically, the districts are districts that are seeing very little business or commercial growth, and they are typically targeting specific types of businesses to go into those districts. So it's a very targeted effort. For a few years, the city of Farmington used their community development block grant money, which is a federal program that all cities get, to make loans to start up businesses. They have actually backed off of that in the last couple of years. The one rather unique part of that program is that in order to get that loan and stay within the guidelines of a CDBG grants funds, you had to employ low-income people, and the owners of the business had to make their tax returns available to the city of Farmington every year. That's a tough thing, and I think that's one of the reasons why they got away from it. The city of Rosemount does have what they call code improvement grants. They're primarily used in their redevelopment of their historic downtown. Basically, if you want to have a business that needs to do a facade upgrade or something like that, they will work out a grant to help you with that. Brooklyn Park, for a number of years, has had a revolving loan program. They seeded the program with money out of their Economic Development Authority levy funds initially. Now it is actually a self-sustaining program on the interest that they get back on the loans. And those loans are basically at market rate, so they're not competing with their banks, but in many cases they're giving loans to businesses that might have trouble qualifying for those. A lot of cities will assemble land. The city of Burnsville did that in 2 different cases. Up in the South Cross area years ago, we assembled, basically we bought a huge farm that was up there, and then when we did the heart of the city, we did a lot of a land assembly there. In the case of the heart of the city, typically we would purchase land with another buyer right in the wings. And in some cases, they may be one or two buyers. So in many cases, we literally sat at the same closing table, bought the land, and then immediately resold it to someone else. The one exception to that is the AAA land on which the Ames Center sits and the one undeveloped parcel sits. We have a policy right now from council that says staff should not approach landowners about purchasing their land, but should only respond to questions from landowners about would the city want to buy my land. So it's a very cautious. For example, do not go down in the MRQ and go talk to a whole bunch of landowners and attempt to assemble a huge piece of property that you could use for a big development. Only respond if someone in the MRQ comes to you and says, I want to get rid of my land. A few years ago, we did have a company ask us to purchase 2 parcels in the MRQ. We were not able to come to agreement on the price of those parcels, and interestingly enough, the Asselford family purchased those 2 parcels when they were doing all of their soil remediation, because they saw what a good deal the soil remediation program was, and they've now got them all remediated, and they're part of a group of parcels that they're marketing right now. Another tool that some cities use is basically a land subsidy, and that is you take EDA or city-owned land and you basically sell it at below its appraised or valued cost. The city of Burnsville did do that with UTC Aerospace a few years ago. We did basically sell them a piece of ground we had right next to where our soccer fields are, which is UTC Aerospace land. We sold it to them below cost, with the idea that when they use those in the future for expansion, this piece of land they were getting from the city of Burnsville could be their green space. It is basically a swamp area, so it has virtually no development possibilities. It's perfect for the green space, and since it kind of sat down on the bottom end of the whole soccer parcel, it was quite frankly a good deal for both sides. There have been some cities around the country that have had what they call economic development foundations. These are typically private foundations, and they are typically business owners in these cities at their time of retirement or possibly their time of passing on their business have elected to make a contribution into a foundation, and then a foundation board grants loans or grants to businesses to either come to the cities or expand. And again, these are typically done privately. They're not done by cities. One that I came across earlier this year that was rather interesting, the city of Sherman, Texas, passed a sales tax to be used for economic development. And that sales tax generates about $3 million a year that they use towards economic development. The caveat is that also part of that tax buys down personal property taxes. So there was kind of a win-win for everyone there. I can tell you that about 8 or 9 years ago, the city of Burnsville was looking at a whole bunch of different options, and one of the options was a sales tax option to help with economic development. That did not meet with great approval from businesses in Burnsville, nor did it meet with great approval by our Chamber of Commerce. The feeling was that would make our businesses, if we had a half-a-cent sales tax, that would make them non-competitive to all the surrounding businesses in the other communities. It was quickly one of the options taken off the table. Another tool some cities have used is incubators. Owatonna is probably one of the foremost in our state. The incubator down in Owatonna has probably been there for about 20 years now. Basically, you can, as an emerging business, you can get space within this incubator very cheap, and that also comes with the director of the incubator will provide you with business assistance, consulting, and everything else, almost similar to our Open to Business program. The caveat there is when you come out of the incubator, you need to go into space in the city of Owatonna. That's the development process that comes out of that incubator. That model would be a little harder to do in a city like Burnsville where we're already surrounded by other communities. I mean, Owatonna obviously is a standalone community, so it's a little bit easier for them to do, but it is an interesting model that's been on the table. Little history of non-TIF and tax abatement incentives in the city of Burnsville. Back in 2011, this body and the council basically discussed all of the items that I just went through for you, except for the Sherman, Texas item. And at that time, council preferred what they referred to as a market-driven approach. That is, they believed that a developer should do at their cost whatever is needed to do to develop their land and or to get a business, and that the city didn't need to do anything beyond our typical TIF and tax abatement. The following year, in 2012, the EDC asked for some further discussion on incentives, and staff came up with a policy that was referred to as a loan guarantee policy. Basically, the city of Burnsville would guarantee half of a loan to a business not to exceed $20,000 once that loan was totally bank approved. The EDC recommended that policy be enacted. Council reviewed the policy, and council had some concerns about the risk of the policy, so the policy did not go forward. In 2014, at a council work session, staff did bring a number of options to address distressed properties, commercial properties in the city of Burnsville, and council asked to have that discussion kind of encapsulated into our comp plan discussion that we're going to have next year. So that's kind of one of the things we moved into that we will look at next year. If we were to do any additional incentives, more than likely they would have to be funded through our EDA levy. Our EDA levy currently makes the bond payments for the Ames Center. It currently makes the $25,000 per year contribution to Greater MSP. It currently covers the $7,500 per year expenditure for the Open to Business program. And then it currently covers all of the Economic Development Department expenses, including my salary and benefits. At this point, it's unlikely that our EDA would look to increase the EDA levy to put new incentives on the table. And we've obviously had that discussion with them in the past couple of years. Many of the things that you asked for additional information about and discussion opportunities are going to happen next year when we do our new comp plan. The heart of the city will be part of that discussion. Economic development options and opportunities will definitely be part of that discussion. Matter of fact, they will play a bigger part of the comp plan discussion than they have typically played in the past. And that is actually somewhat of a directive from the Met Council, who guides the comp plans. They are saying, hey, we want comp plans to address economic development. Our comp plan has always addressed economic development, but it will look at it and address it in an even stronger fashion. The questions on the rigidity or flexibility of zoning will be part of this comp plan discussion next year. And then the whole purpose of the comp plan is to develop that long-term strategy. The plan would be that both this commission and the Planning Commission would participate on an ongoing fashion in discussions about pieces of that comp plan. So to a certain extent, what I'm presenting to you is that a lot of what you asked for after that March meeting is going to happen, but it's going to be incorporated into our whole comp plan discussion, and both this commission and the Planning Commission will have input into that comp plan. And at this point, Mr. Chair, I would certainly attempt to answer any questions the commission may have.
And again, in this presentation, there's no action required.
That's
So
correct, Mr. Chair.
If anybody had any direct questions for Skip or comments, we can go ahead and address them right now. Looks like there's nothing further from our commission regarding the developer plan panel. With that, do we have any updates?
Mr. Chair, the STEM activity report was part of your background. I would just draw the commission's attention to two things. As you know, we did hold our BECREC bus tour in May. We had 38 brokers who participated in the bus tour. We had a number of other folks who came for the reception afterwards. We have continued to receive compliments on from the broker community about the bus tour. They like it. The building owners like it. Most of the building owners that participated this year said they probably would be willing to participate next year. Thank you to Commissioners John, Copen, and Shaw, who were part of that event and attended that event. And it has, the 2 years we've done it, it's proven to be a very, very positive event for the brokers. I would also bring your attention to, there is a new initiative that is starting up, and it's a partnership between the school district, the chamber, and the city of Burnsville. And the attempt is going to be made to get about 48 business people who will go spend a half a day within a school and kind of learn how a school functions and what goes on in the school, and see what the difference of a school today might be from when some of us were in school. And that's going to occur in October. And then in November, the hope is to get 100 teachers and send them into businesses in Burnsville to get an idea of how a business functions. And then there will be a lunch that day to kind of take a look at what has everybody learned. Long term, what is hoped is going to come out of this is that some of these businesses will agree to possibly do mentorships, internships. The school district is looking to create what they call career pathways, and they're hoping some of these businesses will agree to give them input on the career pathways. So basically what the school district is saying to the business community is, when we design a pathway, we want your input on what the students should be studying to be functional workers when they come out into your businesses. Very unique partnership, and we're in the discussions. The other update I would bring forward is just to remind you that there are actually 2 open houses occurring on July 16th. At 3 o'clock, the Gramercy is going to have an open house. They have been in Burnsville for a number of years. And then at 6 o'clock, the Lions down in their park on Cliff Road, they've added a new splash pad, and they're going to do an open house for that. Commissioners are invited to both of those, and it may be a day in which, one of the parts of our work plan is for commissioners to attend open houses and ribbon cuttings. Could be a day where you could knock off a couple if you so desired. If there are any questions about the updates, I would certainly answer those questions.
Thank you, Skip. And with that concludes our meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
A motion.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And the motion is passed. Thanks for viewing tonight. That concludes our meeting.
Thank you, Commissioners.